Welcome, friends. Thank you for joining our study today. We're continuing our study of the book of Revelation, and today we're studying in the 17th and 18th chapters, in which is heard this great cry from an angel, Babylon is fallen. We've seen the persecution that God's people were enduring in the time when John wrote this letter. John himself was the subject of persecution. He'd been exiled to the Isle of Patmos. And in the letters that he wrote to the seven churches, of course, he, as an exile, was one that was suffering from the church in Ephesus, the church in Pergamum, the church in Smyrna, the church in Philadelphia. All were ones that were undergoing persecutions. It was that had begun with Nero. It was that was continuing on into the time in which this letter was written, in the early 90s or the mid-90s. And so, in the 18th chapter, the 17th chapter, Babylon is described, and the cry is heard, Babylon is fallen. Now, of course, Babylon was a spiritual term for a ruling force that was in the world. And we've seen that the purpose, or not the purpose, but rather the origin of the persecution of God's people began with the great red dragon, which we see in chapter 12, Satan. He was one that had a red head. He was red. He was one that had 7 heads and 10 horns, and he was a persecutor of God's people. We find that he found enemies of the Lord's people that were his allies. And he stood by the sea, and he saw coming up out of the sea a beast that was red, and it was like a leper. It was that was one that had feet like a bear. It had a mouth like a lion, and it was that was the symbolism of that empire that had begun with the days of Babylon, when God's people were exiled. And as he looks and he identifies this beast that came out of the sea, it also was red. It had 7 heads and 10 horns. And then we see this description of this harlot, this woman, and her demise is that is indicated. And John shows her in the 17th and 18th chapters. And as we look, he tells us, and we see this scarlet woman, and she was in the wilderness, and she was seated upon a beast, and this beast was red and had 7 heads and 10 horns. And so what we're looking at, we have the same spirit that was pervasive, and that warred against the saints of God. As we look in that 17th chapter, we find this woman described in elegance, of one that possesses great riches, and one that was a power of enticement. But this woman really was not a woman. She was a city. And this city is that is defined for us in no uncertain terms in the last verse of the 17th chapter. And the record says, "And the woman which thou sawest is the great city, which reigneth over the kings of the earth." And so what he is describing is Rome. Not just the city of Rome itself, but the temptations, the riches, and all of the things that are there. And then as that chapter concludes, then John hears an angel that comes with a great voice shouting, "Fallen, fallen, Babylon is fallen." And so in the 18th chapter, we see the fall of this city. And as the city's fall is described, the voice of the angel says that Babylon has become the center and the place of dwelling for every demon. And it is that also is the hole for every unclean bird and every unclean creature. And not only was she that, but John, having thus described her in that way, warns and says, "Come out of her, my people. Don't partake of her pleasures and her temptations, lest you likewise partake of her plagues." And we must recognize that there was a warning there. And this warning is that while it has to do with the matter of the city of Rome and the things that they offered to the world, it was written to the 7 churches of Asia scattered far away from there. But they were likewise to come out of that because they could, even though they might not be literally in the city of Rome, they could partake of the dainties, of the riches, and be one that was enamored and ensnared by the things that this woman had to offer, this world empire. And so God says, come out of her and don't partake of her pleasures, lest you partake likewise of her plague. And then we find that John hears the angel say, rendered unto her double, fill up the cup twice. And John is not, the angel is not telling John we're going to be one that she's going to suffer twice the punishment for her sins, but rather he's saying you make the scales equal. Remember that oftentimes in years past that the matter of determining weight was to have something that was of a weight, and I wanted to reach the measure of that weight. Then on the other side of the scale, I would weigh, and when the level and the scales were equal, then that meant that the thing that I wanted was equal to the weight of the scale. And so when he says double unto her, he just simply make the scales right and bring them to bear. She has sinned greatly, now produce and now punish her with the equality of punishments for the sins and for the hurt and the anguish that she's brought as far as others are concerned, rendered unto her double. And then we find that he says that Babylon was very arrogant, and she was one that, no, it's not going to happen to me. He said that she sits and she says, I'm a queen, and I'm not going to be a widow, and I'm not going to do mourning. And so many individuals entice them becoming enticed in sin, have this kind of spirit. It will happen to others, but it's not going to happen to me. But it does, and it happened to Babylon. And we see all different kinds of people that lamented and mourned because of the fall of Babylon. The kings mourned because they found their power and their strength from her centers. And the merchants of the earth lamented and wept over her fall because she was that brought so much revenue to them, and their livelihood depended upon the selling of their wares there. And the mariners, the ones that ship goods back and forth, they lamented the cry of the fall of Babylon, because it was that they also depended and made their living upon the things that this woman, this wicked woman, was that brought to them. But the saints were told to rejoice. But then hear the voice of the downfall as far as this woman is concerned. And the record says, and a strong angel took a stone, as it were a great millstone, and cast it into the sea, saying, thus with a mighty fall shall Babylon, the great city, be cast down, and shall be found no more. And what symbolism this is. And it calls to mind the literal Babylon, Babylon the Great. And Rome is called Babylon because she was the replica of the first Babylon. And as we look at the angel taking a stone and casting it into the sea and say, Babylon is fallen, that brings to mind a memory of what had happened to the first Babylon. There were many prophets that spoke of Babylon's downfall. Isaiah had spoken of her downfall. And Jeremiah spoke of her downfall, and particularly in Jeremiah's prophecies that he spake of this city. He told of her demise and how that she would come to an end. And Jeremiah was very graphic in his prediction of the fall of Babylon. He wrote his prophecies on an epistle, and he sent a messenger from Judea to that ancient city of Babylon. And the record declared that messenger was instructed, you read this epistle of the warnings of the downfall of the city, and then you do something. You take a millstone, and you tie this epistle to it, and you cast it in the midst of the river Euphrates, and you shall say that fallen, fallen is Babylon. Babylon, the city, was that continued for some years, but became less and less of importance and significance, and ultimately becomes only a term as far as the world is concerned of remembering it. And Babylon, the second, which was Rome and was the center of that power that was there, of the riches, of the lust and the cravings that individual had. It was the second Babylon, and she too fell. Now, the city Rome exists today, but the city that then ruled the world, it rules no more. It is fallen into a lesser power, and that city is gone. The scripture declares that four of those that were allies together and enemies of the people of God and of God, Satan, the beast that came out of the sea, the earth beast, and Babylon, these four allies. The last of these to be identified was Babylon, the city, and paradoxically enough, the fall of Babylon was the first that is written down for us in this 18th chapter of Revelation. But now we're going to see the quick demise of the other enemies. We're going to look at the 19th chapter, and we're going to see the destruction of the beast that came out of the sea and the earth beast. And then we're going to look in the 20th chapter, and we're going to see where the dragon likewise is going to meet his demise, and how that ultimately he will too be cast in the lake of fire and brimstone. And so, stay with us, because in our next lesson we're going to study about the fall of the red dragon, or the red beast that came out of the sea, and the earth beast, and that battle of Armageddon that you hear so much about. So stay with us and study with us in our next lesson as we continue our study of this book called Revelation. Thank you, friends. May God bless you, one and all.